Part 1. The Road to War. Imagine living in a small country of just 3.7 million people. Across your eastern border stands one of the most powerful nations on Earth. A nation with millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. Almost everyone believes the war, if it begins, will last only a few days. But history had a different plan. In the frozen forests of Finland, one of the greatest underdog stories of the 20th century was about to unfold. This is the story of the Winter War. Europe on the edge. By the late 1930s, Europe was rapidly descending into chaos. Germany had already annexed Austria and dismantled Czechoslovakia. Adolf Hitler's ambitions were becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, another great power was making plans of its own. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, feared that a future enemy could attack Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg. The city stood dangerously close to the Finnish border. If war with Germany erupted, Stalin believed Finland could become a launching point for an invasion. To prevent that possibility, Moscow demanded that Finland hand over territory on the Karelian Isthmus and allow the Soviet Union to establish military bases. In return, Finland would receive larger, but far less valuable, areas farther north. For the Finnish government, accepting these demands would mean surrendering strategic land and weakening national security. Negotiations continued for weeks. Neither side was willing to compromise. Eventually, diplomacy failed. The incident that changed everything. On November 26, 1939, artillery shells exploded near the Soviet village of Mainila. The Soviet government immediately accused Finland of launching the attack. Finland strongly denied any involvement and proposed an international investigation. The proposal was rejected. Just 4 days later, without a declaration of war, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops crossed the border. The Winter War had begun, a war everyone thought was already over. Military experts around the world expected a quick Soviet victory. The numbers seemed overwhelming. The Soviet Union deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and massive air power. Finland had only a fraction of those resources. Many newspapers predicted that Helsinki would fall within weeks. Some believed Finland would surrender before Christmas. But they underestimated one thing. The Finnish people knew their forests. They knew their lakes. They knew their winter. And they were willing to fight for every meter of their homeland. Part 2. Into the Frozen Hell. As dawn broke on November 30th, 1939, the silence of the Finnish wilderness was shattered. Soviet artillery opened fire across the border. Moments later, waves of bombers appeared over Finnish cities. The Winter War had officially begun. For the Soviet leadership, the campaign seemed simple. The Red Army outnumbered the Finnish forces by more than 3-1. It possessed thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and enough artillery to crush almost any opponent. Many Soviet officers believed the war would be over in less than 2 weeks. Some soldiers were even told to pack only enough food for a short campaign. But Finland had prepared for a very different kind of war, fighting against impossible odds. The Finnish army had fewer than 300,000 soldiers. Their tanks were almost non-existent. Their air force was tiny compared to the Soviet Air Force. In terms of equipment, Finland had almost no chance. But the Finns had something far more valuable. They knew their homeland. Every forest, every frozen lake, every narrow road cutting through the endless wilderness. Instead of defending every kilometer of the border, Finnish commanders chose another strategy. They would allow Soviet columns to move deep into the forests, then destroy them piece by piece. Winter becomes a weapon. Nature itself became Finland's greatest ally. Temperatures soon dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Sometimes they reached an incredible -40. Engines refused to start. Fuel froze. Weapons jammed. Even breathing became painful. Soviet troops, many wearing uniforms designed for much warmer climates, struggled to survive. Large formations moved slowly along narrow roads because tanks and trucks could not travel through deep snow. This made them predictable and vulnerable. Hidden among the snow-covered trees, Finnish soldiers watched every movement. They wore white camouflage that blended perfectly into the landscape. Often, Soviet troops had no idea they were being observed. Ghosts on skis. Then came the attacks. Almost without warning, groups of Finnish ski soldiers burst from the forest. Moving silently across the snow, they struck supply trucks, destroyed communication lines, and disappeared before Soviet forces could react. To frightened Red Army soldiers, it seemed as though invisible ghosts haunted the forests. The Finns never stayed long enough for a direct battle. Instead, they attacked where the enemy was weakest. Food supplies disappeared. Fuel convoys burned. Ammunition never reached the front. Little by little, massive Soviet formations began to lose their strength. The Motti tactic. One Finnish strategy became legendary. It was called the Motti tactic. Instead of attacking an entire Soviet division, Finnish troops divided it into smaller isolated groups. Roads were blocked with fallen trees. Bridges were destroyed. Columns stretched for kilometers suddenly found themselves trapped, unable to move forward, unable to retreat. Each isolated pocket was surrounded, then destroyed one at a time. It was a simple idea, but against an army dependent on roads and heavy equipment, it was devastating. Panic in Moscow. Reports arriving in Moscow became increasingly alarming. Entire Soviet units had disappeared. Convoys vanished without explanation. Officers complained that they were fighting an enemy they could barely see. The Red Army had expected open battles. Instead, it found itself trapped inside an endless frozen maze. Every tree could hide a sniper. Every hill could conceal an ambush. Every silent forest seemed alive. The confidence that had filled Soviet headquarters only days earlier slowly turned into frustration. The easy victory Stalin had promised was beginning to slip away. A war the world was watching. Across Europe and North America, newspapers followed every new report. How could such a small nation resist one of the largest armies in the world? The courage of Finnish soldiers captured the world's attention. Volunteers from several countries traveled to Finland to help defend the nation. Although their numbers were limited, international sympathy for Finland continued to grow. The world realized that this would not be a short war. It would become one of the greatest stories of determination in military history. Ending. But the most legendary defender of Finland had not yet entered the story. A quiet farmer, armed with nothing more than a rifle, would soon become one of the deadliest snipers the world has ever known. His name, Simo Häyhä. To be continued. Part 3, The White Death. As Soviet losses continued to rise, fear spread throughout the Red Army. It wasn't only the freezing temperatures. It wasn't only the endless forests. There was something else. Someone. A sniper so deadly that soldiers began whispering his name around campfires. A man who seemed impossible to see, impossible to stop. His name was Simo Häyhä. History would remember him as the White Death, a farmer turned legend. Before the war, Simo Häyhä lived a quiet life. He was a farmer, a hunter, a man who had spent years in Finland's forests. He knew how to move without making a sound. He knew how to remain perfectly still for hours. Most importantly, he knew how to shoot. When the Soviet invasion began, Häyhä volunteered to defend his homeland. He carried a simple Finnish rifle. No advanced optics. No expensive equipment. Just skill, patience, and years of experience. Invisible in the snow. Every morning before sunrise, Häyhä had disappeared into the forests. Dressed completely in white camouflage, he blended perfectly with the snow. He packed snow in front of his firing position to reduce the cloud created by each shot. He even kept snow inside his mouth while aiming. That prevented warm breath from revealing his position in the freezing air. Every tiny detail mattered. Every movement could mean death. For Soviet soldiers, the forest itself seemed alive. One shot, one target. Unlike many snipers, Häyhä preferred using iron sights instead of a telescopic scope. A scope could reflect sunlight. Even a tiny flash might expose his location. Iron sights kept him hidden. Day after day, his number of confirmed kills continued to grow. 1, 10, 50, 100, then even more. By the end of the Winter War, he was credited with over 500 confirmed kills, making him one of the deadliest snipers in military history. Whether every number can be verified is still debated by historians. But one fact is certain. The Soviet army feared him. Soviet counterattacks. Commanders ordered artillery strikes into forests where Häyhä was believed to be hiding. Entire sections of woodland were bombarded. Snipers were sent specifically to eliminate him. None succeeded. Every failed attempt only strengthened his legend. Soon, Soviet soldiers began calling him the White Death. It was a name spoken with fear. The battle intensifies. While Häyhä became a symbol of Finnish resistance, the fighting across the front grew even more brutal. The Soviet Union refused to accept defeat. Fresh divisions arrived from across the country. Thousands of new tanks rolled toward Finnish defensive positions. Aircraft filled the skies. Artillery fired almost without pause. The Red Army began learning from its mistakes. Commanders improved coordination. Infantry received better winter clothing. Supply lines became more organized. Slowly, the balance of the war began to change. The Mannerheim Line. One obstacle still stood between the Soviets and victory. The Mannerheim Line. This defensive system stretched across the Karelian Isthmus. Although it wasn't as massive as some people imagine today, it was carefully designed to use the natural terrain. Concrete bunkers, trenches, anti-tank obstacles, dense forests, frozen lakes. Every position forced Soviet troops to fight under extremely difficult conditions. The battles became relentless. Every hill, every bunker, every trench was defended with incredible determination. The cost for both sides continued to rise. The shot that nearly changed everything. On March 6, 1940, Simo Häyhä's incredible streak almost came to an end. During fierce fighting, he was struck in the face by an explosive bullet. The wound was devastating. He collapsed into the snow. Many believed he had been killed. But against all odds, he survived. When he finally regained consciousness, the war was almost over. Ending. By early March 1940, Finland had shown the world what courage could achieve. But courage alone could not replace ammunition, or tanks, or men. The Soviet Union was preparing one final massive offensive, and Finland faced the most difficult decision of the entire war. Fight to the last, or seek peace. To be continued. Final part, victory at a terrible cost. By March 1940, both nations had paid a terrible price. The forests of Finland were silent once again. But beneath the snow lay thousands of soldiers who would never return home. For more than 3 months, Finland had fought against overwhelming odds. Again and again, the Finnish army had delayed one of the largest military forces in the world. But time was running out. Stalin changes his strategy. Humiliated by the early failures, Joseph Stalin demanded results. The Soviet High Command reorganized its forces. Experienced commanders replaced ineffective leaders. Fresh divisions arrived from across the Soviet Union. Thousands of additional artillery pieces were deployed. Heavy tanks rolled toward the front. Aircraft bombed Finnish positions almost daily. This was no longer the poorly coordinated invasion of November. The Red Army had adapted. And now, its enormous industrial power began to make the difference. The breaking point. The Mannerheim Line had held longer than anyone expected. But no defensive line could survive endless artillery bombardments forever. Day after day, Soviet shells destroyed bunkers. Communication lines collapsed. Entire villages disappeared beneath explosions. Finnish soldiers fought with extraordinary determination. But ammunition was becoming scarce. Food supplies were limited. Exhaustion spread through the ranks. Every victory cost lives that Finland simply could not replace. The country's leaders faced a heartbreaking reality. If the war continued much longer, Finland itself might cease to exist. Peace at last. On March 13, 1940, the guns finally fell silent. After 105 days of brutal fighting, the Winter War was over. The Moscow Peace Treaty forced Finland to surrender about 11% of its territory, including much of the Karelian Isthmus and the city of Viipuri. More than 400,000 Finnish civilians had to leave their homes. Many would never return. For Finland, it was a painful sacrifice. But it remained an independent nation. And that changed history. The cost of war. The Soviet Union had achieved its objective. But the victory came at an enormous cost. Historians estimate that the Soviet Union suffered well over 100,000 deaths, with some estimates considerably higher when missing soldiers and later fatalities are included. Finland lost around 25,000 soldiers, an immense loss for a nation of only a few million people. The world was shocked. No one had expected such fierce resistance from such a small country. A lesson the world could not ignore. Military observers across Europe carefully studied the conflict. They saw Soviet tanks trapped on narrow roads. Poor leadership. Weak coordination. Heavy casualties. Adolf Hitler was watching as well. Some historians believe that Germany's later invasion of the Soviet Union was influenced, in part, by the Red Army's disappointing performance during the Winter War. The conflict demonstrated both the weaknesses of the Soviet military in 1939 and its ability to learn, reorganize, and improve under pressure. The legacy of the Winter War. Although Finland lost territory, it earned something that could never be taken away: respect. Its soldiers proved that courage, training, leadership, and knowledge of the terrain could challenge even the most powerful armies. The names of places like Suomussalmi, the Mannerheim Line, and Kala became symbols of determination. And one man, Simo Häyhä, entered history forever. The White Death survived the war, recovered from his wounds, and lived until 2002. He rarely spoke about his achievements. When asked if he regretted what he had done during the war, his answer was simple: "I only did my duty." Final thoughts. The Winter War was more than a battle between two nations. It was a story of survival, a story of determination, a reminder that numbers alone do not decide the outcome of every conflict. Sometimes, preparation defeats confidence. Sometimes, knowledge defeats power. And sometimes, a small nation can change the way the entire world thinks about war. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Battle Chronicles, and join us for more incredible true stories from history. Until next time, thank you for watching.